Russia to America. But Cuba was right on the American doorstep. If he could get some short-range missiles into Cuba, if he could do that, if he could manage that, he could take away the American advantage with one stroke. So then we come to the Cuban Missile Crisis, 1962. Everybody's agreed this is Kennedy's finest hour. Guy comes into President Kennedy and says George Bundy McGeorge Bundy, the National Security Advisor, with pictures showing that the Russians have set up nuclear missile sites in in Cuba. Nuclear missile sites that are able to strike America. Immediately, some generals want to go to war. Immediately, some generals are saying, listen, we're going to send an airstrike, we're going to be able to knock those sites out. And this is the temptation. This is the temptation that presidents face. Military action, it seems decisive, and it seems swift, and it seems like it's going to make all your problems go away overnight. And it looks so cool on TV, all those big powerful fighter jets flying overhead and dropping their napalm bombs. It just looks like you're blowing your enemy straight to hell. Kennedy, though, had learned from the Bay of Pigs. He had learned, A, you don't take your military advisors' advice without criticising it. And so he started to ask some critical questions. He started to ask, well, how do you know you'll hit all the nuclear weapons? Well, they didn't know they would get all the nukes because they didn't know how many Khrushchev had sent to Cuba and where they all were. And so Kennedy's got a problem. He could send his fighter bombers over and they can drop napalm all over the sites. And they can wipe out every site that they see. But how does he know that there isn't a nuclear weapon hidden in some mountain at the back of Cuba, aimed at an American city that he misses, and then all of a sudden America's hit with a nuke? So he was prepared to criticize his military advisors. He was prepared to criticize them, not to take everything they said on face value. And the second thing he realized was the lesson that Eisenhower had taught him. When you go to war, you go all in. It's all or nothing. You can't back down. And so he immediately realized, if I drop napalm on those missile sites and I kill thousands of Russian soldiers, Russia's going to fight back. Khrushchev will probably send his tanks into West Berlin in response. I'll invade Cuba. Khrushchev will do something else, and before very long we'll be sending nuclear weapons at each other. He understood the risks. He realized that it wasn't Russia that was the enemy, it was nuclear war itself that was the enemy. He had to find a way of getting those nuclear weapons out of Cuba, but without going to war. He understood the nature of the problem. And so his advisors came up with the idea of a naval blockade. As advisors, he brought all the top men in the government into something called EXCOM, the Executive Committee. And these guys decided to set up a naval blockade. And the idea was that they wouldn't attack Cuba. What they would do is they would stop the Russians from resupplying their troops, from resupplying those missiles. So they surrounded Cuba with 63 ships. They made sure that there were plenty of allies from South America. So other South American nations sent ships up. And they surrounded Cuba and they said no more Russian ships were to come through. We're going to stop that. The idea was to stop resupply without actually going to war. 10 a.m., Wednesday, October the 24th, 1962. The Americans sat in a room. The American president, his top advisor, sat in a room in the White House and listened and heard American naval commanders radio in that the Russian ships were turning around, that they were either stopping or turning around. One advisor said, listen, we just went eyeball to eyeball, and the other guy just blinked. What they didn't realize is what we now know is that 24 hours earlier, Khrushchev has decided, go right up to that line, but turn around, do not go through. Khrushchev was not prepared to go to nuclear war over Cuba. Khrushchev then sent a letter. He sent a telegram to America saying that if America agreed not to invade Cuba, he would pull out his nuclear weapons. He would take the nuclear missiles out. But then the next morning, another telegram came through from Khrushchev. And this one said, listen, if you promise not to invade Cuba, we'll take our missiles out. But you've got to take your missiles out of Turkey. Turkey is very close to America. And as a response to the previous crisis in Berlin, President Kennedy had put Jupiter missiles in Turkey. They were old missiles, they didn't have a great range, but they could strike Russian targets. And Khrushchev saying, right, if you take your weapons out of Turkey, let's do a fair exchange. You take your weapons out of Turkey, I'll take mine out of Cuba. Now, it might seem like a fair exchange to us today, but here was Kennedy's problem. Khrushchev had promised him that he would send no nuclear weapons or missiles into Cuba. He had promised him in front of the world he would not do that. And then he had lied. And he had basically snuck nuclear weapons in, set them up in Cuba. That had all the appearances of a sneak attack. Kennedy couldn't reward that sort of behaviour. He couldn't basically, if he was to say, okay, well, I'll take my weapons out of Turkey, he was basically saying, well, yep, if you do sneaky things in America, you'll get something out of it. He couldn't do that. At least he certainly couldn't be seen to do that. He couldn't let the American public, make the American public aware of that. But the other thing that Kennedy was very, very good at was hiding his weaknesses. Kennedy suffered from all sorts of medical conditions. He had suffered from extraordinary back pain. He had to spend most of his life being the presidency being injected with amphetamines from a guy who was basically a upper class drug dealer, nicknamed Dr. Feelgood. This guy injected him with all sorts of feel-good drugs just to get through his day-to-day life as president. Yet he projected himself as the guy who was young and energetic and healthy. He was taking so many pills, if you shoot Kennedy, it rattled. He understood the power of deception as a president. His wife, Jacqueline Kennedy, was a beautiful woman. He always had Jacqueline Kennedy on his arm. They were always photographed together, the perfect couple. Kennedy was notorious for his affairs. He was at least with 2 other women on the night he was sworn in as president. So he understood the power of deception. So Kennedy and his brother came up with an idea. Khrushchev has sent 2 letters. The first letter says, guarantee that we will not go in, guarantee that you will not invade Cuba, says Khrushchev, and I'll take my missiles out. The second letter says, guarantee you won't invade Cuba, and take your missiles out of Turkey, and I'll pull my missiles out. Kennedy and his brother simply ignored the second letter and responded to the first and said, yep, absolutely, we'll take our missiles out. He sent his brother, Bobby Kennedy, to meet the Russians. And Bobby Kennedy says, yep, we will pull our missiles out of Turkey 1 year from now. But you're not allowed to tell people we've agreed to that. If you do that, we're going to end up at war. It was an extraordinarily tense moment, because what had happened earlier that day is the Russians had shot down an American plane over Cuba, been shot down by a surface-to-air missile, and some American generals wanted the president now to go in shooting. But the Russians agreed. They agreed, yes, you give us a public guarantee that you will not invade Cuba, we will take our missiles out, and we'll keep quiet about the deal over Turkey. So, by learning about the power of deception, which he had learned as a politician, he had effectively learned how to lie. But also his lessons from the Bay of Pigs, the first Cuban crisis. Don't listen to your advisors. Criticize them. Ask critical questions. Double check their plans. And also the lesson he had learned from Eisenhower, when you go to war all in. And if you're going to war with Russia, that means nuclear war. Kennedy was able to defuse probably the time when we came closest to a nuclear war in human history. It's possible that 30 million Americans would have died in the first day of war. Something like 2 to 3 times that in Russia. It would have been a devastating attack. But Kennedy managed to avert that. He managed to get the weapons out of Cuba. So far as he could tell, they were never actually allowed. Castro rejected the deal completely, wouldn't allow the Americans to look at it, but it certainly seemed that the weapons went away. He made America look stronger than Russia. He put America firmly out in the lead in the world's mind. In the mind of the world, Russia became the bad guy. It had been sneaky. It had broken its promises. It had put nuclear weapons on Cuba. He made America look strong and modern and reasonable. Khrushchev would lose his job in 1964, partly because of the mess he had got Russia into over the Cuban Missile.